Close your eyes and picture a medieval castle. Grand stone halls with roaring fireplaces, elegant lords and ladies in flowing gowns, knights in shining armor feasting at massive wooden tables laden with exotic delicacies. Got that romantic image locked in? Great, now throw it in the garbage. Medieval castles were humanity's first false advertising campaign. From the outside, they screamed power, wealth, and sophistication. Inside, they were colder than your ex's heart, smellier than a gym locker room, and deadlier than a Game of Thrones dinner party. The gap between castle fantasy and castle reality is so wide, you could fit the English Channel in it. These stone fortresses weren't palaces of luxury. They were survival bunkers where even the richest nobles lived in conditions that would horrify modern college students. Ready for a medieval reality check that'll make you kiss your thermostat and hug your toilet? Let's explore what castle life actually looked like when the fairy tale cameras weren't rolling. Medieval nobility had a complicated relationship with cleanliness, and by complicated I mean they avoided it like the plague. Bathing wasn't completely unknown, but it was rare and viewed with suspicion. Medieval medical theory claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you vulnerable to disease. So instead of regular washing, nobles relied on a medieval hygiene hack. Change your linen undergarments and hope for the best. The wealthy would switch their linen shirts frequently, sometimes daily if they could afford it. This was considered peak hygiene since the clean linen would absorb sweat and oils from the skin. Then, they'd layer on heavy outer garments that might not see soap for months. But here's where it gets gross. Even with fresh linen, everyone was crawling with lice and fleas. These weren't signs of poverty. They were universal medieval roommates. Nobles would openly pick lice from each other's hair during conversations, like it was a casual social activity. Special combs designed for lice removal were common luxury items. Medieval fashion made everything worse. Dense, multi-layered clothing trapped sweat, dead skin, and whatever medieval perfumes they doused themselves with. Rich fabrics like velvet and wool were expensive to clean, so they'd just add more perfume when things got funky. The really wealthy tried to mask their natural human musk with imported spices, rosewater, and herb sachets sewn into their clothing. Imagine Axe body spray, but with lavender and cloves, trying to cover up months of accumulated human essence. Court documents from the time occasionally mention nobles being asked to step back during conversations because their aroma was overwhelming other courtiers. When medieval people, who lived with open sewers and rotting food, find your smell offensive, you know you've crossed the line. Medieval castle bathrooms make modern porta-potties look like five-star hotel suites. Guardrobes were the castle toilet system. Essentially, holes cut into exterior walls that dropped waste straight down. No plumbing, no flushing, just gravity doing its messy work. The waste would fall into cesspits, moats, or sometimes just splatter against the castle walls and accumulate in festering piles. Privacy? What's that? Many guardrobes were communal spaces where multiple people would sit side by side on wooden planks, conducting business while having casual conversations. Medieval toilet etiquette was basically non-existent. The smell situation was catastrophic. Entire sections of castles would become uninhabitable when guardrobes overflowed or when wind conditions were wrong. Some castles had to relocate their toilet facilities multiple times because the stench became unbearable, even by medieval standards. This created one of history's worst job descriptions, the gong farmer. These brave souls would descend into cesspits and sewage tunnels to clean out accumulated waste. They were paid well because the work was incredibly dangerous. Toxic gases, disease exposure, and occasional drowning in human waste made it a high-mortality profession. But even gong farmers couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Medieval waste management was basically throw it outside and hope for the best. Castle inhabitants would walk past walls streaked with human waste like it was normal architectural decoration. Winter made everything worse. Waste would freeze in the guardrobe chutes, creating blockages that would back up into the castle. Spring thaws brought the delightful experience of months of accumulated frozen sewage, suddenly liquefying and flowing through the courtyards. Medieval castle kitchens were controlled chaos zones that somehow managed to feed hundreds of people without killing them all. Picture massive stone hearths blazing with fires hot enough to roast entire deer. Sweating cooks wielding cleavers the size of small swords, hacking through joints of meat while smoke billows around them. The air, thick with grease, herbs, and the constant sizzle of fat hitting flame. Without refrigeration, cooks became preservation experts. They salted, smoked, pickled, and dried everything they could get their hands on. Meat hung in cool cellars, fish was packed in barrels of salt, and fruits were preserved in honey. When these techniques worked, the food lasted months. When they failed, cooks had to make judgment calls about what was still safe to eat. Medieval pragmatism meant cutting away obviously spoiled parts and cooking the rest thoroughly. A piece of beef turning questionable around the edges? Trim it off and throw it in a heavily spiced stew. This wasn't negligence. It was survival in a world where wasting food could mean starvation. The bread situation was particularly interesting. Honest bakers produced quality loaves, but dishonest ones would stretch their flour with cheaper ingredients like ground peas or even sawdust. This wasn't standard practice. It was fraud that could get you dragged through town with a bad bread tied around your neck. Rats were the kitchen's persistent nemesis. Castles kept armies of cats to hunt the rodents that treated grain stores like personal buffets. But rats are clever. They'd chew through containers, contaminate flour stores, and leave evidence of their visits everywhere. The massive cooking fires filled kitchens with smoke that made everyone's eyes water constantly. Kitchen workers developed chronic coughs and respiratory problems from breathing smoky air all day. But the alternative was cold food and hungry nobles. Medieval castles were perfectly designed to breed and spread disease on an industrial scale. Pack hundreds of people into stone buildings with minimal ventilation. Add contaminated water sources and primitive waste management. Then season with unwashed bodies and pest infestations. Congratulations, you've created a medieval biological warfare laboratory. Water supplies were often the weakest link. Castle wells could be contaminated by waste seepage, and moats, which doubled as sewers, sometimes served as water sources during sieges. Drinking water that had been sitting in stagnant pools collecting waste runoff was essentially playing Russian roulette with dysentery. When plague hit medieval Europe, castles became death traps. Dense populations living in close quarters with poor sanitation created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried plague, and plague killed entire castle populations within weeks. But plague wasn't the only killer stalking castle halls. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and respiratory infections thrived in the crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. Medieval medicine consisted mostly of prayer, bloodletting, and hoping your immune system could handle the bacterial warfare happening inside your body. The mortality rate for noble children was astronomical. Most families lost half their children before age 5, not from accidents or violence, but from diseases directly caused by their living conditions. Even wealth couldn't buy you clean air or disease-free water when you're living in a stone petri dish. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval castle inhabitants often had shorter lifespans than rural peasants, despite having access to better food and resources. Why? Because peasants didn't live in concentrated disease factories surrounded by stone. If noble life in castles was rough, servant life was a complete nightmare with worse pay and no escape clause. Castle servants lived in cramped quarters near their workspaces, kitchen workers above the cooking areas, stable hands with the horses, and cleaning staff wherever they could find a corner to sleep. Their beds were straw pallets that got changed maybe twice a year if they were lucky. These straw mattresses became ecosystems of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and creatures that medieval people didn't even have names for. Servants would wake up covered in bites and spend their days scratching while trying to work. The food hierarchy was brutal, but practical. Servants ate whatever the nobles didn't want: coarser bread, vegetable scraps, and the less desirable cuts of meat. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it wasn't the literal garbage some myths suggest. Castle lords had economic incentives to keep their workers alive and functional. Some servant jobs were particularly hellish. Laundresses worked with freezing, often contaminated water. Gong farmers cleaned waste systems. Kitchen staff breathed smoke all day. Stable workers lived surrounded by animal waste and hay that was often moldy. But here's the twisted irony. Stable hands were sometimes healthier than indoor servants because they got fresh air and weren't trapped in the disease-breeding stone chambers. Working outdoors with horses, despite the manure, was often safer than serving food in smoky kitchens or cleaning chambers in airless towers. Most servants died before age 30, not from overwork alone, but from respiratory diseases, infections, and accidents caused by working in dangerous conditions with primitive safety measures. Medieval winters turned already uncomfortable castles into frozen survival challenges that would make modern camping look luxurious. Those romantic fireplaces you see in movies? They barely heated the room they were in while filling the entire castle with smoke. Medieval heating was so inefficient that people would literally freeze to death in their beds, just feet away from a roaring fire. Castle walls were thick stone that stored cold like medieval refrigerators designed by sadists. The damp stone would leach heat from your body even when you were sitting next to a fire. People wore multiple layers of clothing and never fully removed them during winter months. Windows were just holes in walls covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or thin sheets of horn if you were wealthy. Glass was rare and expensive. This meant living in near darkness for months while icy wind whistled through every gap in the castle's defenses. By spring, people's winter clothes had essentially fused to their bodies with layers of grease, dead skin, and accumulated filth. The first warm day that allowed for clothes washing was practically a castle holiday. Winter overcrowding made disease spread faster. People huddled together for warmth, sharing whatever respiratory infections they'd accumulated during the cold months. The mortality rate during medieval winters was catastrophic, not just from cold, but from diseases that thrived in the concentrated, unventilated conditions. Food storage became a gamble. Root vegetables might last, but stored meat could spoil even in freezing temperatures if it wasn't properly preserved. Spring often brought the grim discovery of winter food stores that had rotted while frozen, creating medieval horror scenes in castle cellars. Medieval castles were history's greatest marketing scam. Impressive facades hiding uncomfortable truths about daily life in the Middle Ages. From the outside, these stone fortresses projected power, wealth, and sophistication. Inside, even kings lived in conditions that would horrify modern college students. Cold, drafty rooms, contaminated water, primitive sanitation, and constant health risks were just normal parts of noble life. The next time you flip a light switch, turn on hot water, or flush a toilet, remember that you're living better than any medieval monarch ever did. Your average modern apartment bathroom